But it may not be that surprising that most people believe, as I do, that we should all have the right to make the choices and decisions we want about our own bodies. And let's be clear, we are not talking about a choice between life or death. We are talking about giving dying people a choice of how to die. Yeah. So, Mr. Speaker, let us examine what that choice currently looks like. I do not have a legal background, but I've always been driven by a strong sense of injustice. If I see a problem, I will do everything I can to try and solve it. Indeed, in this job, we all do that every week and every day, whether here in Parliament or in our constituencies. And when 4 former directors of public prosecutions, including the Prime Minister, and 2 former presidents of the Supreme Court, and many lawyers all agree that the law needs to change, surely, Mr. Speaker, we have a duty to do something about it. Yeah. Intentionally helping another person to end their life is currently illegal under the Suicide Act 1961 and carries a maximum prison sentence of 14 years. This includes family and friends helping someone who is terminally ill to die, both in the UK and overseas. And existing guidance does not stop people from being investigated by the police, adding fear, guilt and further trauma to grieving families. The law is not clear and it does not protect individuals, families or medical professionals. And this drives people to very desperate measures. And what about coercion? Well, as senior KCs have said, there is currently no established system for identifying abuse or coercion in advance of a person's death, and for helping vulnerable people to make end-of-life decisions. So basically, Mr. Speaker... Will my honourable friend give way? I will give way on that.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Mr. Speaker, I've been a nurse for more than a quarter of a century, and in that time I've worked mostly in intensive care as a specialist there. I've worked with really compassionate and very skilled, well-trained clinicians who've been taught to spot coercion. It's fundamental to our practice. Will my honourable friend agree with me that it is wrong to suggest that clinicians cannot spot coercion in these cases?
Yeah. He makes a very important point, and I thank him for his intervention and I thank him for his years of service as a nurse. I've spoken to many medical professionals about this issue, and they will say that this is part of their job. They are very skilled, working closely with patients, particularly dying patients, to assess their needs and have those very difficult and delicate conversations. Because at the moment, as the KCs say, we currently check for coercion in the cases where people have taken their own lives when someone is dead. Yeah. This bill would make coercion a criminal offence with a sentence of up to 14 years. Surely by putting a legal framework around this really difficult situation, we will provide an extra level of safeguarding. Indeed, as one psychotherapist, who is terminally ill herself, said to me recently, coercion happens when things are hidden away. This bill would bring things out into the open. Surely that has to be safer for everyone. Yeah. And let us look at what the absence of a robust legal framework looks like. I will give way.
Very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way and thank her for giving the House the time to debate this morning. She references coercion, and I understand the point that she makes about the 2 medics. But the medics won't be able to see or have heard anything and everything at all times. People will not be put beyond challenge because subsequent to the death, if a relative claims coercion of another relative, investigation will remain. I'm just entirely unclear how, without peradventure, 2 clinicians can claim that there has been no coercion at any point.
I mean, the Right Honourable Member has kind of made the point for me there, in that, you know, we're going to check for coercion in a very robust system. We don't have any of that now. So at the moment, the person will definitely be dead. We have to look at the status quo by putting layers of safeguarding and checking for coercion. That's got to be better than the system that we've got now. I will.
Much for giving way at that point. Colleagues are right to raise questions around coercion because all of us know, and I hosted a phone-in on LBC where people rang in and said, I feel like I have to end my life because I recognise how difficult it is for my family to see me suffering. But the limitations of this bill are that you must have 6 months to live, according to 2 doctors and a judge. So I genuinely believe that this massively reduces the risk of coercion, because we're really saying that people are so desperate to bump off their families that if they were told they had 6 months to live, they would escalate this process so they could do it sooner.
She makes an excellent point. You're absolutely right. And the very strict criteria within the bill add extra layers of safeguarding, again, which we just don't have at the moment.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will.
I really appreciate my honourable friend giving way and have the deepest respect for my honourable friend, but one thing that really concerns me is societal or systemic coercion. Elderly people in our society pay thousands of pounds per month at the moment to be in care homes. What reassurances can my honourable friend give me that an elderly person in a care home who's been given 6 months to live, won't privately feel themselves, I'm a burden, I've been given 6 months to live. If I end my life now, I can save my family between £25,000 and £55,000. It really concerns me.
Well, again, as I've said already, at the moment we have no idea whether that person would take action because we're not having those conversations. We're putting this out into the open, getting 2 medical professionals involved, getting a High Court judge involved. And actually, evidence from other jurisdictions shows very clearly that coercion tends to happen the other way. What tends to happen is families are saying to the person who might really feel that they want to take the choice of an assisted death, they try to stop them from doing it. I'll take one more intervention.
For giving way. Isn't it the case that the conversations that the patients will have with the doctor will bring out exactly whether somebody has been coerced or whether actually somebody is suffering intolerably? This is, of course, the criteria. It's a suffering. It's not whether somebody worries about that they're a burden.
I agree, absolutely, and those conversations that are just not taking place at the moment are very important. I'll make some progress if I may, Mr. Speaker. There's quite rightly been a lot of discussion about palliative care in recent weeks, and I'm convinced that a significant amount of that discussion would not have taken place without the introduction of this bill. It's a long overdue conversation, and I'm very pleased to see it happening. I've met with the Association of Palliative Medicine, Hospice UK, Sue Ryder and Marie Curie, and last week I was delighted to attend the inaugural meeting of the All-Party Group for Hospices. I also attended the fantastic Kirkwood Hospice, which serves my constituency of Spen Valley. And I want to pay tribute to the dedicated staff and volunteers across the country who work in the palliative care sector, doing some of the most vital work in society. We must do more to support them, and I look forward to working with the government and colleagues across the House in this important endeavour. And that is why I've included in the bill a requirement for the Secretary of State to report to the House on the availability, quality and distribution of palliative care. And of course, assisted dying is not a substitute for palliative care. It is not an either-or. We have some of the best palliative care in the world in this country, and when it can meet the needs of terminally ill people, it is second to none. But surely, when it cannot, the choice of an assisted death should be one component of a holistic approach to end-of-life care. The comprehensive report from the Health and Social Care Select Committee, published earlier this year, found no indications of palliative care deteriorating in quality or provision where assisted dying was introduced. Indeed, I will.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Ever mindful of what the Honourable Lady has said about the criteria that's in place, can I remind the Honourable Lady in particular of Belgium, where it started off with a simple project like the Honourable Gentleman, Honourable Lady is referring to today, but then deteriorated to and expanded to dementia and under 18s children, and how that impacts. So what guarantees have we that this legislation today will not end up as it will in Belgium, in which case anything goes? Is that the Honourable Lady? Is that what the Honourable Lady really wants? I don't want it, does she?
The Honourable Member for his intervention, but look, let's be very, very clear. A huge amount of research has been done by the Health and Social Care Select Committee and indeed by myself and others. The model that has been proposed here is nothing like happens in Belgium. It is nothing like happens in Canada. It is strict, stringent criteria, and if this House chooses to pass this bill, that criteria cannot be changed. And I'll come on to that. I will.
To the Honourable, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady giving way and congratulate her on the measured way in which she's conducted this debate over the last few weeks. And whatever side of the House, whatever the side of the debate, I'd like to recognise that. It's not always the case. But is it not the case that this crosses a new irreversible medical red line for doctors and for nurses? And is it not the case that in other bills that we've seen through in this House over the years, that the safeguards invariably over time become obsolete? So the safeguards in this bill, however well meant, should be seen as temporary safeguards, not immutable safeguards.
Absolutely not. I mean, I respectfully disagree with the honourable gentleman. The countries where a bill of this nature has been implemented, the safeguards have been in place and the boundaries have never changed. I'll take one more and then I must make some progress.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I have a great deal of sympathy for the arguments that she's making. However, we have seen time and time again excessive judicial activism taking the words in this House and expanding their meaning into places we had not seen in the first place. So what reassurances can she give that the words in her bill will be respected by the judiciary and we won't find ourselves in a totally different place that this House did not intend?
Gentleman for his intervention. The courts have repeatedly put this issue back to Parliament. This is not their domain. This is the legislation and it is not their domain. It is strict criteria. I must make some progress. So, coming back to palliative care, Mr. Speaker. In those situations where pain simply cannot be managed, the result is deaths which are so horrific that the person themselves can spend hours and in some cases days in unimaginable pain as they die. And I want to bring the debate back to the issue we are trying to solve. And for their loved ones, no matter how many joyful and happy memories they have, they also have the trauma which comes from watching someone you love die in unbearable agony and fear. And that memory stays with them forever. Rebecca's mum, Fiona, developed metastatic brain cancer at the age of 69. She had very good palliative care, but her pain could not be managed and she died begging and screaming for assistance to end her suffering. Her family and the medical team treating her cried beside her bedside as it took her 10 days to die. Lucy's husband, Tom, was 47, a music teacher with a young son. He had bile duct cancer, which obstructed his bowel, resulting in an agonising death. Tom vomited faecal matter for 5 hours before he ultimately inhaled the faeces and died. He was vomiting so violently that he could not be sedated and was conscious throughout. Lucy pleaded with the doctors to help. The doctor treating him said there was nothing he could do. His family say the look of horror on his face as he died will never leave them. Lucy now has PTSD, which is quite common for families who lose loved ones in such harrowing circumstances.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I look.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for the powerful and moving recollection of stories she is giving. A constituent of mine watched her mum suffer from pancreatic cancer. Unable to keep any food down, she basically starved to death. Does the honourable member agree with me that this is no way to see a loved one die? Does she also feel that we did not come into this place to shy away from difficult choices, but to listen to our constituents and to make better laws for everyone?
I thank my honourable member for her intervention, and I'm so sorry to hear that story from her constituency. But I know that we all have stories from all our constituencies. And she's absolutely right. We are here to make difficult decisions. But in terms of the example that she gives, I have been astonished by the number of people who have been in touch with me to tell me about their terminally ill loved ones who have starved themselves to death out of desperation, something which takes far longer than you may imagine and is just horrific for everyone involved. And this is currently legal, and doctors are required to assist the patient through this agonising process. How can we allow this but not a compassionate and humane assisted death? If you... Alan.
Thank you so much. Can I join the honourable member opposite in commending her for the way that she's made sure that this binary debate has not been a polarising one. However, I started the debate where she is just now, and she mentioned stories. The things that have moved me in this debate to opposing this bill today is that I've also heard stories of disabled people who have had do not resuscitate put onto their medical records without their permission, of them being stopped by strangers in the street and being told you would be better off dead. And I know she will say that we are dealing and voting today on the specifics of her bill, but we're also voting on a principle. And would she agree with me that There should be a precautionary approach to this. And does she honestly believe that the process of this is giving us the time to be sure that we would be making the right decision?
The Honourable Member for his intervention, and I will come on to some of those points further in my speech. But let's be very clear, the title of the bill is terminally ill adults. It is not disabled people, it is not elderly people, as someone else referenced. The criteria are very, very clear. And I come back to the status quo, which is the problem that we're trying to address. If you want to avoid the trauma of some of the harrowing circumstances I've described, you can have an assisted death, just not in this country. If you have £10,000 or £15,000, you can make the trip to Switzerland or elsewhere. But because of the current legal position, it is often a deeply distressing and very lonely experience, shrouded in secrecy, with people feeling like criminals as the fear of prosecution hangs over them. Ilana's husband, Crispin, had late-stage MND. He was paralysed, and Ilana is a wheelchair user herself. But at his request, she took him on what was a traumatic and difficult journey to Switzerland. She describes the intense stress and anxiety she felt due to the total secrecy of their plan. And we can only imagine what the journey home was like, on her own, with an empty seat beside her. And of course, Mr. Speaker, there are those terminally ill people who take matters into their own hands. Gareth's father, Norman, served in the Welsh Guards. He was a strong man, but his final 5 years were full of pain and discomfort. He had prostate cancer, which he lived with for 15 years. He was given good initial hormone therapy and chemo, but the cancer spread everywhere, and the pain could not be eased. And one day, when it all became too much, he went into his garden with the gun he owned and shot himself. Gareth's sister rushed to his house and found him. Gareth said his father just wanted the pain to stop. And there is Peter from Murfield in my own constituency. Peter stopped me in a car park a couple of weeks ago to tell me the harrowing story of his beloved wife, who was diagnosed with metastatic cancer aged 52. The treatment was ineffective and her symptoms were unbearable. She took an overdose of her medication and Peter found her and took her to hospital. She recovered and he brought her home. But the following day, she made another attempt to take her own life, in a way which is too awful to describe. Peter found her dead, and he spent the next 8 hours being questioned by the police. It's estimated that over 600 terminally ill people take their own lives every year. Often patients will store up medication. 33-year-old Josh from Huddersfield went to coach his local kids rugby team one Saturday and came back to tell his mum all about it. He found her dead. Lisa, who was terminally ill, had stored up her medication and taken her own life. And of course, there is our former colleague, Paul Blomfield, the previous MP for Sheffield Central, who has campaigned tirelessly on this issue since his dad, Harry, took his own life alone in his garage in 2014 after being diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. And language matters. Harry was not suicidal. He loved life, but he had watched too many of his friends have lingering, degrading deaths, and he did not want that for himself. But like the others, he couldn't tell Paul and his family of his plan, as they would have been complicit and could face prosecution. And how many precious days and weeks did Harry miss out on as a result of having to take action while he was still physically able to do so? Hearing these stories is not easy, but it's important that we do.
On that point, my right honourable friend.
I will.
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for giving way. What I've really been struck by in recent weeks, listening to members across this House, is that there is a clear agreement that the current situation is neither sustainable nor dignified. Almost everyone in this House agrees that the status quo is unacceptable in terms of dignity, in terms of palliative care, and in terms of end of life. So seeing this, does my honourable friend agree that today's debate is about how we depart from this unacceptable situation that we currently face, and that today's vote is the first stage in an important discussion about how we improve the end of life for hundreds and hundreds of people across this country?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and I wholeheartedly agree. I'm setting out what we are dealing with now. This cannot be right, and surely we have a duty to do something about it. And I'm going to make some progress if that's okay. And Mr. Speaker, some of the most important voices in this debate are, of course, those of people who are currently living with a terminal illness. Having a terminal diagnosis is perhaps one of those situations where it's very hard, if not impossible, to know how you would feel. I have met many terminally ill people over recent weeks, and every one of them is in my thoughts today. Sophie, who is here today, was diagnosed with stage 4 secondary breast cancer, which has spread to her lungs, liver and pelvis. She is allergic to opioids, so she knows that her pain is very unlikely to be able to be managed. She has a 17-year-old daughter, and all she asks is to have the choice to say goodbye to her at a time of her choosing in circumstances she can have some control over, and for her daughter to be able to remember her as the vibrant, positive woman she is. Nathaniel, who also joins us today, has stage 4 incurable bowel cancer, which is now in his liver and brain. Like many of us, Nat says he doesn't know if he would choose an assisted death or not, but he simply cannot understand why anyone would want to deny him the choice. He says, I wish to live as fully as I can and for as long as possible, but when the time comes, Nat also wants the right to die with dignity and compassion. Another very emotional lady came up to me at a recent interfaith event I attended. She and her husband thanked me for putting the bill forward. And she said, Kim, I am a proud Christian and I am guided by my faith, but I also have terminal cancer and I want the right to choose a compassionate death. I know there has been much discussion about the views of people who hold religious beliefs about this subject. I fully respect those beliefs, and I don't intend to say much more about this other than that I know there are a range of views within faith communities. Indeed, some of the most powerful conversations I've had have been with people of faith, including in my own constituency. People of different religions have said, whilst they would not choose an assisted death for themselves or for their family, who are they to stop someone else who may want to make that choice? Mr. Speaker, I'm going to make some progress if I may. Mr. Speaker, I hope that I have set out the problem that very clearly exists. Now allow me to set out how this bill can address this problem, but most importantly do so safely and effectively. If this bill were to become law, it contains the most robust and strongest set of safeguards and protections in the world. There are very strict eligibility criteria and multiple layers of checks and safeguards embedded in the bill, none of which exist at the moment, as we have seen. I made a very conscious decision to name the bill Terminally Ill Adults End of Life, rather than anything else. That title can never be changed, and it ensures it is only adults who are dying that would ever come within its scope. As such, this bill is not about people who are choosing between life and death. It is about giving dying people who have got 6 months or less to live autonomy about how they die and the choice to shorten their death. The bill does not apply to people with mental health conditions. It does not apply to the elderly. It does not apply to people with chronic health conditions, and it does not apply to disabled people. Unless, of course, they have a terminal illness, in which case they would and should be entitled to the same rights as anyone else. Yes, I will.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. One group of people that are not often talked about are the learning disabled. Now, in clause 9(3)(b), it says that if an assessing doctor has any doubt as to the capacity of the person, that they may refer them for a further psychiatric assessment. Would the honourable member consider, if this bill is voted for today, would she engage in a debate about whether that language should be strengthened from may to must, and whether the training that is required and the experience of the assessor is strengthened as well?
Excellent point, and she also highlights a community who we must consider in light of this bill. I would absolutely be open to that conversation at Bill Committee. I think it's a very, very valid point. There are different views within the disabled community. As Professor of Disability Research Sir Tom Shakespeare says, it's unacceptable that people with disabilities continue to face social stigma and inequalities. However, it would be a mistake to conclude that we should oppose legalising assisted dying for terminally ill people until those wider problems are fixed. It is paternalistic and wrong to imply that inequalities will be resolved by reducing choices. A clear, transparent legal framework for end-of-life choice is better for everyone. He is right. There is, of course, still work to do in the fight for equality for people with disabilities, but once again, it's not an either-or. I will campaign alongside many others in this place for those rights, but I will also campaign for the rights of terminally ill people, because their rights are as important as anybody else's.
Would my honourable friend...
I will.
I'm very grateful to her, and I have huge respect for the way in which she's conducted this debate over the past few weeks. My concern is that she has focused today on the individual and the individual choice. but we are here to legislate for society as a whole. And in legislating, what we are saying if we pass this bill is that this is okay to take that choice. And there will be some people, there will be some people who are in that situation with 6 months of their life to go, who actually will then feel, ought I to do this? Is this something that I now should do? And it brings into play a whole set of considerations which are about, is it better for my family? Is it financially better for my family? In ways that at the moment are out of scope. So I think rather than simply focusing on the individual suffering, which we all recognise is acute, we must actually broaden it out to the impact that the legislation will have on society as a whole.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and what I would suggest is that actually this bill will give society a much better approach towards end of life. We're already seeing conversations about dying and death in a way that we haven't seen, I don't think, enough in this country. We have to take a holistic view, and indeed that's what's happened in other countries and other jurisdictions. Having those deep and meaningful conversations about death and dying is really, really important. But he actually quite nicely brings me on to the protections and safeguards within the bill. Under this bill, yes.
I'm very grateful to her for giving way, and on precisely that point, a decade ago I voted against this bill. I felt maybe it's not perfect, maybe there's more things that I need to know. And she's absolutely right, we haven't talked about death again for 10 years, we've never considered this legislation. The truth is, if we vote against her bill today, it will be the end of the conversation once again for another decade.
He's absolutely right. And how many people will go through the situations I have described if it's another 10 years before we address this matter? Under this bill, I'm not going to take any more interventions now, I'm afraid, because I'm very conscious there's lots of people who want to speak, and I know the Speaker is very conscious of that as well. Under this bill, any terminally ill person who wants to be considered for an assisted death would have to undertake a thorough and robust process involving 2 doctors and a High Court judge. No other jurisdiction in the world has those layers of safeguarding. The person requesting assistance must have mental capacity and a settled wish at every stage. That means they must repeatedly demonstrate that they understand the information relevant to their decision, the ability to retain that information, and to use or weigh that information as part of the process of making the decision. We know that capacity can fluctuate, which is why it is assessed at every step of the process. I'm sorry, I'm not going to take any more. I need to make some progress. The court must speak to one of the doctors and can hear from anybody else they deem necessary. If there is any evidence of coercion, the court will not approve. And if it emerges subsequently, the court order could be revoked. It's also important to note that the person can change their mind at any time with periods of reflection built in. Having consulted at the highest levels in the judiciary and the medical profession, I know they can and will fulfil these safeguarding responsibilities and have the expertise to do so. And let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend said earlier, this is not brand new territory for doctors. Doctors working in partnership with other clinicians are already required to manage complexity in end-of-life decision-making. I follow the request of the BMA that doctors should be under no obligation whatsoever to participate. But if they do, they will receive appropriate training and support, and doctors should be able to use their professional judgment when and if a conversation takes place, taking their cue from the patient, as they do in many other issues. And I welcome this patient-centred approach. Many doctors feel the change in the law would safeguard clinicians and patients by making everything explicit. And, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the detail of what assisted dying would look like, we have the benefit of drawing on the experience of 31 countries around the world, jurisdictions around the world. I could talk extensively about the international experience of assisted dying. The Health and Social Care Select Committee report did a brilliant job of this. And this bill has looked at best practice and also models which I, and I know many others, would not be comfortable with us having here in England and Wales. Reflecting on their experience, clinicians in Australia say, through deep and meaningful conversations between doctors, patients and their loved ones, we can dispel fear, reduce suffering, bring death and dying out of the shadows, and so allow patients and their families a better quality of life and a better quality of death. And as one Australian Member of Parliament said, We have brought behind closed doors practices into the open and given dying people meaningful, transparent choices. Crucially, none of the fears that were put forward as reasons not to change the law have been realised. The status quo was broken and assisted dying works. And evidence from around the world shows that the option of having an assisted death actually lifts the fear that terminally ill people have, and many never actually use it. But they are able to make the best of the time they have left due to the comfort and reassurance it provides. People talk about a slippery slope, but the Health and Social Care Select Committee found that not one jurisdiction which passed laws on the basis of terminal illness has expanded its scope. And none of the jurisdictions which have introduced... It's absolutely true. That is absolutely true. And as the courts, both here and in Europe, have made clear repeatedly, Parliament is sovereign. And this bill could not be made any broader through any judicial process. And, Mr. Speaker, speaking of process, with reference to the bill, having listened to what I know are genuine concerns of members about ensuring we get this legislation right, I want to commit to the House that if the bill passes second reading today, which I sincerely hope it does, I am minded to move a motion that gives the Bill Committee the power to take oral and written evidence in order to ensure that a thorough approach continues to be taken. That is not normal procedure for a private member's bill, but I think it is the right thing to do. I also want to reassure colleagues that the Bill Committee will meet over a number of weeks, meaning there is ample time for full consideration of the details of the bill, including amendments. And the committee will be representative of the views of the House and also the makeup of the House. Let me be clear, that will mean there will be representatives of different parties with a range of views on the committee. And as the Leader of the House said at the dispatch box just yesterday and has said several times, the government will, of course, work with me to ensure that the bill is workable and operable. This will quite rightly take time. And I've included in the bill a commencement period of up to 2 years. This is not going to happen overnight. But that time frame can be explored at committee stage, as it's more important to get this right than to do it quickly. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, for the reasons I have set out, I am very clear that the law needs to change to give terminally ill people choice at the end of life and to protect their loved ones from fear of prosecution. And, Mr. Speaker, for those of us here today who are lucky enough not to have personal experience of this issue, sadly, we know that any one of us could end up in this heartbreaking situation. We are all living longer, which is brilliant. And I've campaigned inside and outside Parliament for a greater focus on prevention and early intervention in terms of illness and disease to keep us fit and healthy for as long as possible. But any one of us or our loved ones could be unfortunate or unlucky enough to receive a terminal diagnosis. And I struggle to see how it is fair or just to deny anyone the autonomy, dignity and personal choice that we might want to take control of our final weeks. And the right to choose does not take away the right not to choose. Giving the choice of an assisted death to those who want it would, of course, not stop anyone who is terminally ill from choosing not to do so. Mr. Speaker, whatever happens today, I'm incredibly proud of the work my fantastic team and the many campaigners have done on this hugely significant, emotional and sensitive subject. But we need to be clear. A vote to take this bill forward today is not a vote to implement the law tomorrow. It is a vote to continue the debate. It is a vote to subject the bill to line-by-line scrutiny in Bill Committee, at report stage and at further reading. And then, of course, the bill will go to the Lords for what I have no doubt will be further robust debate and scrutiny. Mr. Speaker, this will be a thorough process focused on one of the most significant issues of our time. An issue that people across the country clearly want us to address, none more so than the many families who are facing the brutal and cruel reality of the status quo. Today is the beginning, not the end of that process, but the debate can only continue if colleagues join me in the I lobby today, and I wholeheartedly encourage them to do so. I beg to move that this bill be submitted.
The question is that the bill now be read a second time. Lily Kruger.
Speaker, I think you indicated that I could speak for a little longer than 8 minutes. Thank you very much. I just don't want to have too much grumbling at the 8-minute moment. I'll take about 15 minutes. and time for intervention. So may I start by paying tribute to the Honourable Lady for her very powerful speech, and indeed for the way that she's led this campaign with great respect and sensitivity, and to use the contested words, with great dignity. And she and I knew each other before we were MPs, when we both worked in the charity sector, and I like and admire her greatly, and I know that we have more in common than might appear today. And Mr. Speaker, we all have this in common in this House. We all share a deep concern about the experience of people dying or fearing death, fearing pain and suffering. And I wear heavily on my conscience the people whose lives will be prolonged beyond their wishes if I get my way and this bill is defeated today. I will not disregard those people or minimise their anxiety. And we will hear those voices in today's debate, and we've heard many of them already, spoken through honourable members in what I know will be very moving speeches. But, Mr. Speaker, if I voted for this bill, I would have on my conscience many more people whose voices we cannot hear. The people who would be vulnerable in consequence of the huge changes that this bill would induce in our society and in the NHS. And my view is that if we get our broken palliative care system right and our wonderful hospices properly funded, we can do so much more for all the people that we'll hear about today, using modern pain relief and therapies to help everybody die with a minimum of suffering when the time comes. But we won't be able to do that if we introduce this new option. Instead, we will expose many more people to harm. Mr. Speaker, I want to go through the bill in a moment, but first a word about process in response to the points made by the Honourable Lady there. This bill is simply too big for the time that it's been given. And I implore honourable members not to hide behind the fiction that it can be amended substantially in committee and in its later stages. The remaining stages of a private member's bill are for minor tweaks, not the kind of wholesale restructuring that we will need if we're ever to make this bill safe. And so members who vote for the bill today must be prepared to see it become law, largely unamended. And I suggest that if they do have any doubts, the only responsible choice is to vote no and let the advocates of assisted dying bring back a better bill at another time. Happy to give way.
Deeply appreciate the respectful way he's making the point today, but I stand here before him not sure how any colleague in this chamber cannot have doubts whichever way they're voting today. It feels to me that there are two necessary harms we are all forced to weigh up, and I'm deeply intrigued to hear if he is so certain that doubts should push people one way, why that is, when it is very clear there are many people who will continue to suffer unnecessarily if we reject this bill.
Well, I recognise there are very many doubts on each side, and I fully respect the arguments that have been made by the Honourable Lady. Of course, this is a finely balanced debate. But the point about process, though, is this bill is too flawed. There's too much to do with it to address in the committee stage. And by all means, let's have this debate, but we should be having it before a bill of this magnitude is brought, and the process of the bill should be much more comprehensive. Let me give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. But contrary to what the media are saying, today's decision is not about bringing this matter into law. It's about allowing it to go to the next stage. And if people have got misgivings, surely rather than making the assumptions that he is now today, assuming that in fact it cannot be corrected or amended to make it palatable to people who we all have doubts, that surely today's vote is to simply say, let it go to the next stage. The final decision at third reading is the one that is the critical one to decide whether it goes to law or not.
I think I made the point that this bill is too comprehensive and there's too much in it to address in the process of a private member's bill. And if the Honourable Gentleman thinks there are serious concerns with this bill that he thinks he would not be prepared to see come into law, then he should not be supporting it today. But let me try and explain. Let me move on now to try and explain what the concerns with the bill are that I think are too comprehensive to be dealt with in any committee stage. Now, I recognise how hard the Honourable Lady has worked to try and ensure that it is safe, and I don't believe it is for these reasons. So let's start at the beginning. The process starts with a conversation between a patient and a medical practitioner, not a doctor necessarily, just a medic of some sort, unspecified at this stage. If the patient tells their ordinary family doctor that they want an assisted death, the doctor is obliged to either explain how it works or to pass them on to someone who'll do it, which is probably what will happen, by the way, I think, Mr. Speaker. The likelihood is that we would see this new branch of medicine spring up, like the medics I met in Canada. I will in a moment. These medics I met in Canada, specialists in assisted death, who personally kill hundreds of patients a year in their special clinics. And if honourable members have a difficulty with the language, then I wonder what they're doing here. This is what we are talking about, and I met doctors for whom this is their profession and their job, which they're proud to do. Why don't I give way to that gentleman now?
I'm very grateful for the honourable member for giving way. I just want to be very clear. Medical practitioner is a synonym for doctor. It is not for nurse or pharmacist or dentist or any other practitioner. The practice of medicine, being a doctor, is to be a practitioner of medicine. I think we need to be very, very clear on this. There's lots of law and regulation, and I believe that what the honourable member said is incorrect.
Well, what it actually says is that a doctor means a registered medical practitioner who has such training qualifications and experience as the Secretary of State may specify by regulations. So obviously they are some sort of regulated medic, I recognise that. They're not necessarily a doctor. We will find out. But I recognise they're going to have professional qualifications. It's just not clear what those are going to be, because this is something that isn't in the bill. So, now, going back to this conversation that give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank the honourable gentleman and commend him for the way in which he is engaging in this discussion in the same spirit as the honourable lady from Spen Valley. We often hear that one of the safeguards associated with this bill is that there are medical practitioners involved and that somebody requires a diagnosis of 6 months or less with a terminal illness. But does he accept that medicine is not an exact science? It is the science of uncertainty blended with the art of probability. That there is no exactitude in this, and no court will second-guess medical opinion, though simply look at process.
I agree with the honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right, and I'm afraid the definition of terminal illness, which I'll come to, is in a sense the essential flaw in this bill. But I'll come on to that. Going back to this conversation that the patient has with the medical practitioner, the crucial thing is that the conversation doesn't need to be started by the patient, according to this bill. It can be started by the medic, by any medic, perhaps in hospital, who can make the suggestion of an assisted death to a patient who's never raised the issue themselves, whose family haven't suggested it, whose own doctor doesn't think it's the right thing to do. And so the idea is planted. And then for whatever reason, and by the way, there's no need ever to give a reason, the patient says they want to proceed with the assisted death. And so they sign a declaration, or rather somebody else can sign it for them, any professional, someone they don't know, maybe a new medical practitioner. Anyway, a total stranger can do all the paperwork on their behalf. That's what the section about the proxy entails. And then these two medical practitioners do their assessment. Happy to give way.
Very grateful to the honourable member. I'm very grateful to the honourable member for giving way. I would urge the honourable member to check the wording of the bill, because actually, if somebody signs as a proxy, they have to know the individual for 2 years, and they are simply signing to say that they agree with the patient who wishes to go forward with the assisted dying.
No time to check the bill, but my memory is that it says someone who knows the patient for 2 years, or someone of good standing in the community, which is some sort of professional who's not known to them at all. Anyway, someone can quickly check the bill, but my understanding is it could be a total stranger to them. So we move on to the assessment, which these two practitioners do. Give way.
Isn't the matter very clear? Clause 15, subsection 5. In this section, proxy means a person who has known the person making the declaration personally for at least 2 years, or a person who is of good standing in the community. So there is no protection such as pretended by the supporters of this bill.
Yeah, well done, Daniel. Right, so the assessments have to determine whether the patient is terminally ill, whether they have mental capacity to make the decision, and then whether they've been coerced or pressured into the decision. So let's look at terminally ill. As I said, in many ways the whole question turns on this. I'm afraid this is a term of great elasticity. almost to the point of meaninglessness. It is well known, as the honourable gentleman said earlier, that it is impossible for doctors to predict with any accuracy that somebody will die within 6 months. It is a purely subjective judgment made in this case by a doctor whose job is approving assisted death. They simply have to determine for themselves that not that it's reasonably certain that death will occur, but it can be reasonably expected. So basically, it's possible.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. The thrust of the bill, as I understand it, is to ease suffering and pain with a patient who has a diagnosis who is going to die of the condition which has been diagnosed. But that right could only be exercised within a 6-month period. The pain could be a lot longer than that. The discomfort could be a lot longer than that. Has he heard, because I haven't, what is the importance of 6 months? Why not 8? Why not 10? Why not 12? And what would stop people challenging it on the grounds that the dam has been breached, the 6 months is entirely arbitrary, and therefore it could and indeed should be extended by negative resolution of a statutory instrument?
My honourable friend makes absolutely the right point, and I'm afraid to say that is absolutely the case. It is completely arbitrary, the 6 months cut-off. It's impossible to determine. It's a line in the sand. And of course it could be challenged, as so much of this bill could be challenged on human rights grounds, because every one of the safeguards that has been introduced by the Honourable Lady is in fact, in practice, will be a barrier and a discrimination against the new human right that has been awarded to one group that should of course be awarded to all, if it's being conceded in this way. Give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Earlier this week, myself and other colleagues met with 2 eminent doctors who were former presidents of the Association of Palliative Medicine, and they raised that some of their serious concerns about this bill are the fact that the doctor or medical practitioner who makes the assessment need never have met the person they are assessing or been involved in their care at all. I wonder what the honourable gentleman makes of that.
Lady, she makes a very important point. It's why, I'm not going to get into the question of public opinion, the polling, because it's so contested, but there is a very clear evidence that the doctors who work with the dying and the palliative care professionals are in a great majority opposed to a change in the law, both because they see the damage that it will do to the palliative care profession and services, but also because of the danger that they see for vulnerable patients. So I'm grateful to her point. Why don't I give way? Yes.
I thank him for giving way, and I appreciate that he talks to us as a medical professional, and we need to listen to his views. But isn't it true that any medical assessment is an approximation, something that you cannot say for certain? And isn't it therefore true that for this decision too, we cannot be 100% certain, but that is a way of life, and we cannot make 100% good legislation, because at some point we have to make a decision on balance whether something has merit or not. And for that reason, we should vote for this legislation.
Grateful to the Honourable Lady, especially for promoting me to the status of a doctor. I'm actually a charity worker and a political hack by background, but she's good of her to credit me with these skills. Maybe I should set myself up as a medical practitioner. Yes. I'm grateful to her points, and of course she's absolutely right. There are difficult judgments that have to be made by medics and indeed judges all the time. I think this is a very dangerous one to give them that power to do. It would be very inappropriate. Now, the whole question about the 6-month cut-off is very important. Acknowledge all the points that have been made, but the fact is there's another problem with this definition about terminal illness. The fact is that almost anybody with a serious illness or disability could fit this definition. And I recognise that these are not the cases that the Honourable Lady has in mind for this bill. Of course they're not, but that's the problem with the bill. Because all you need to do to qualify for an assisted death, for the definition of terminal illness under this bill, is to refuse treatment, like insulin if you're diabetic, or in the case of eating disorders, and I bring in my Honourable Lady and I've worked on this topic together. In the case of eating disorders, you just need to refuse food, and the evidence is, in jurisdictions around the world and our own jurisprudence, that would be enough to qualify you for an assisted death.
Does he accept that every day in the NHS, patients refuse treatment and indeed food, and that there's currently
oversight legally around coercion, around other things in that. And wouldn't, by bringing this legislation in, we'd actually strengthen protections around those areas?
Yeah. I'm perplexed by this argument. The suggestion that there may be coercion, of course there will be, and abuse and all sorts of injustice that go on in the current system does not mean to strike me as an argument for regulating and licensing assisted suicide. So if there are concerns that we have about practice in the NHS, let's deal with that. Let's not license suicide, which, by the way, again, evidence from around the world shows increases suicide in the general population. So suicide is contagious, and Oregon, which is often pointed to as an example in this debate, or in suicide outside assisted suicide laws rose by a third since assisted suicide was legalised. So there's enormous contagious effects if we were to regulate and licence it in this way. Good way.
The honourable member for giving way, and he's making an excellent case for the bill to pass today. Because what you're actually doing, sir, is saying that there are specifics that need debate, analysis, discussion in great detail in committee. That's the whole point of it. And if it's not done with properly in committee, if it's not done within committee, then it won't pass the third reading. Your suggestion is, because you don't like specifics, that actually we can't discuss it in any form of detail.
I'm sure the honourable lady is delighted to have the support of the honourable gentleman with his bill, with the bill, and I'm afraid to say I refer him to the point that I was making. This is the inappropriate process. My honourable friend wants to intervene.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend who's making a superb speech, as I expected him to do. And on this issue of process, I say to the honourable gentleman from Boston and Skedness, my constituency neighbour, when I have introduced bills to this House, very serious bills, he will know that those bills, and I think of one in particular, the Investigative Powers Bill, which has become an act, 3 independent reports preceded it, pre-letters of scrutiny of both houses of Parliament across the House, before we went into committee. The point is that process should take place before we consider it here at second reading, not after.
Correct. I'm very grateful. Right, what I'll do now is I'm just going to get to the run through the end of the process before I take any further interventions. So I explained that pretty much anybody with a serious illness or disability could work out how to qualify for this bill, for an assisted death under this bill. And if members think that it's far-fetched, that's what happens everywhere else, that assisted suicide is legal, including in Oregon.
Councillor
Nettles, point of order.
He's using the incorrect language. It's not suicide. That's offensive. Please correct your language, Mr.
That's not a point of order, Danny.
I'm grateful for I'm afraid to say, and I'm sorry if offence is given, the fact is the value of actually having a bill in black and white is that we do need to see what the law really is. And what this bill would do, it would amend the Suicide Act of 1961. It will allow people to assist with a suicide for the first time. So I'm afraid that is, I mean, I respect the honourable lady's concerns there, but I'm afraid we do have to use the proper language here. So, just quickly on this point about the broad scope. If you think that people with anorexia or other conditions that we would not regard as terminal couldn't happen here, consider the young people in the UK today who are given a diagnosis of terminal anorexia and put on a palliative care pathway, essentially assigned to death. And of course these are extreme cases, Mr. Speaker, but there are a lot, I'm not going to give way again. There are a lot of these cases, I'm afraid, and I mention them to show how wide open this bill is.
Can I just say, Honourable, please keep a little calmer. You've intervened twice already. We have lots of other people in this House who also need to be heard. Danny Crew.
And I think particularly of disabled people, Mr. Speaker, many of whom require constant treatment to stay alive, all immediately and by definition eligible under the terms of this bill for a state-sponsored death. And I refer members to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which made the point that the definition and the line between disability and terminal illness is a very blurred one, which is why the title of this bill is in fact so dangerous. Now, I'm going to just make a little more progress. The second question that the medical practitioners have to answer is about mental capacity. And here again is a great vagueness. How do you judge if someone is in their right mind when they're asking for help to kill themselves? The bill says the definition of capacity is based on the Mental Capacity Act 2005. But that act is deliberately expansive. It explicitly assumes capacity in the patient. So having acute depression is no bar to being judged to have capacity under the Act. Being suicidal is no bar under the Act. So the capacity test is no bar at all. And then finally, this question around coercion. Is the patient asking for an assisted death because of pressure from someone else? And there are two glaring problems here. The first is that the process doesn't even attempt to answer the question properly. There's no investigation, no requirement for the medics to interview the friends and family, no need for a psychiatrist or the family doctor to be consulted. The medics just need to satisfy themselves, who knows how, that to the best of their knowledge, the person has not been pressured. But the second problem with this coercion test is that it focuses only on one type of coercion, the less likely type. The bigger danger isn't other people pressuring you to do this, it's you pressuring yourself, and honourable members have made this point. The bill has nothing to say to that. Internal pressure is absolutely fine. If you feel worthless or a burden to others, or if the NHS won't offer you the treatment you need, or if the local authority won't make the adjustment to your home that you need, or if you have to wait too long for a hospital appointment, if you want to die because you think the system has failed you, that's absolutely fine.
One friend just on that point.
I'm going to just move on a little longer. I'll get to the end. Right, so that's the medical stage. I'll just jump straight to the judicial stage. The medical practitioners sign it off, and the judge has to confirm all these same tests as well. And, of course, many eminent judges have made the point that this would overwhelm the family courts if this test was applied properly, but it won't be, because the bill assumes that judges will fulfil this sort of new inquisitorial role, actually look into cases as investigators, which is entirely unknown in the English common law. But it won't require any actual investigation. There's no requirement for the judge to even meet the applicant. They simply have to have a phone call, or maybe it'll be an email, from one of these medics. That's it. That's their inquiry. And on that basis, they must decide if it is more likely or not that there's been external pressure. So the judge approves it. They're required to approve it unless they can find evidence of external coercion. And so we go to the final act, as the bill says, which is when a junior colleague, as a medical practitioner, oversees your death by pills or a lethal injection. And here's the last thing that the bill does or doesn't do. There is no requirement at any stage of this process, the medical or the judicial stage, for anyone to tell the patient's next of kin or their wider family or even their GP what is happening, that the NHS and the judicial system are working in secret to bring about the death of their loved one, maybe their father or their daughter. Now, I say again, these aren't the cases the bill was designed for, but they are directly in scope, and it's going to take more than a tweak in committee to get them out. Now, is this what is meant by having choice at the end of life? Now, let's talk about choice. I'm often accused of, the point was made earlier, accused of wanting to impose my view on others. People say, if you don't approve of assisted death, or don't have one, but don't deprive me of the choice. In fact, the evidence is that with this new option and the comparative loss of investment and innovation in palliative care, real choice narrows. There is a broader point to make about choice, which is that no man or woman is an island. And just as every person's death, even a good death, diminishes us all, so we will all be involved and affected if we make this change. The bill will not just create a new option for a few and leave everyone else unaffected. It will impose on every person towards the end of their life, on everyone who could be thought to be near death and on their family, this new reality, the option of assisted suicide, the obligation to have the conversation around the bedside, in whispers in the corridor. Is it time? And it will change life and death for everyone. Now, coming to the end, Mr. Speaker, I am very aware of the terrible plight of people begging us for this new law. I think we can do better for them than they fear. But we also need to think in real human terms what the effect would be on the choices of other people. And I don't mean the people who are used to getting their way. I'm talking about the people who lack agency, the people who know what it is to be excluded from power and have decisions made for them by bigwigs in distant offices speaking a language they don't understand. The sort of people the Honourable Lady and I both know from our previous charity work and who we all know from our constituency work. Not the ones who write to us campaigning for a change in the law, but the people who come to our surgeries with their lives in tatters, or who the police or social workers tell us about, the people with complex needs. What are the safeguards for them? And I'll tell you, we are the safeguard. This place, this Parliament, you and me, we are the people who protect the most vulnerable in society from harm, and yet we stand on the brink of abandoning that role. The Rubicon was a very small stream, Mr. Speaker, but on the other side lies a very different world, a worse world with a very different idea of human value. The idea that our individual worth lies in our utility valuable only for so long as we are useful, not a burden, not a cost, not making a mess. Let's not be the Parliament that authorises that idea. And I mentioned at the start the voices of those we cannot hear, frail and elderly and the disabled. And since we are surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, let us do better than this bill. Let today not be a vote for despair, but the start of a proper debate about dying well, in which we have a better idea than a state suicide service, in which we remember that we have intrinsic value, that real choice and autonomy means having access to the best care possible and the fullest control over what happens to you while you live, that true dignity consists in being cared for to the end. Thank you.
Can I just remind the House that we want to try and aim up to 8 minutes. Can I have Mother of the House, Diane Abbott?
I should like to congratulate the members of SPEC for bringing forward this bill, which has been the occasion of a very important national conversation. But I would recall to the House that in 1969, Parliament voted to abolish the death penalty for murder. Public opinion was actually against this, but MPs believed on a point of principle that the state should not be involved in taking a life. It was a good principle in 1969, and it remains a good principle today. I am not against legalising assisted dying in any circumstance, but I have many reservations about this bill, and in particular, I do not believe that the safeguards are sufficient. They are supposed to be the strongest in the world because of the involvement of a High Court President of the only those who believe implicitly in judicial omniscience and infallibility, and he adds that he does not, can possibly have any confidence in the efficacy of what is proposed. Is the judge supposed to second-guess doctors? Will the judge make a decision on the basis of paperwork? Or will there be a hearing in open court? And where will be the capacity in the criminal justice system to deal with all this? So far from being a genuine safeguard, the involvement of a judge could just be a rubber stamp.
Well, my learned friend
Yeah.
In more than 2/3 of our care proceedings involving the most vulnerable children in our society, they cannot complete those care proceedings within 6 months. Yeah. Does my learned friend agree that there is a real concern that this safeguard is not deliverable or risks being the rubber stamp that I know that my learned friend doesn't want it to be?
I entirely agree with my honourable friend. Robust safeguards for the sick and dying are absolutely vital to protect them from predatory relatives, to protect them from the state, but above all, to protect them from themselves. There will be those who say to themselves they don't want to be a burden. And I can imagine myself saying that in particular circumstances. Others will worry that assets they had hoped to leave for their grandchildren are being eroded by the cost of care. And there will even be a handful who will think they should not be taking up a hospital bed. We are told...
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and she makes her case powerfully, but can I ask her to comment on the current situation? whereby people ask themselves the questions she has just asked today. What safeguards are there for those people? What inquiry is made before those people pass away and often take the most drastic and horrific action to do so?
But if this House passes this legislation, the issues that I have raised will become even more foremost in people's minds. We are told that there is no evidence of coercion in jurisdictions where assisted suicide is possible. But people do not generally write letters to sick relatives urging them to consider assisted suicide and then put the letter on file. And coercion in the family context can be about not what you say, but about what you don't say. The long, meaningful pause. Yes, of course.
Giving way. As a medical professional and surrounded by even more senior medical professionals, we can all say we all miss things when there's tangibles in front of us. The shadow on x-rays, the markers on blood tests. We miss things as professionals when we can actually see them. What evidence will we have, or what security will we have of picking up things that we can't see, like coercion?
That is the point. Coercion is something that you will have no material evidence of and that you cannot see. People keep saying that this bill can't be amended. Of course, any future government could bring in new clauses. And we can see what happened in Canada, which introduced assisted dying in 2016 for adults with terminal illnesses. In 2021, it was extended to people with no terminal illness and the disabled. And in March 2027, anyone with a serious mental health problem will also be eligible. The House should remember that no single organisation representing the disabled supports this bill.
Would the Honourable Lady give way? Thank you. On that point, my daughter Maria lived her life with severe disabilities and health conditions, and since her birth, we were told many times that she might have only 6 months to live. She lived for 27 years. Crucially, Maria was non-verbal. And I am filled with dread and fear for those other people like Maria who are non-verbal and don't have that capacity, and what might happen to others like Maria if they aren't loved and cared for and have somebody speaking out for them.
I have heard so many stories like that. This arbitrary cut-off of 6 months, it doesn't necessarily meet with the reality of sick people.
Right Honourable Lady for giving way, and I think the case of Maria and others is one that should give us all pause. But does the Right Honourable Lady agree with me? 2/3 of the Cabinet, apparently in principle, support this measure. We should reject it today, but we should as a House commit not to go another 10 years of ignoring this topic, but to come forward in a considered way and ensure that it is looked at properly, and we do everything possible to have a system which is more robust, more caring, and ensures good outcomes for people like Maria.
It does say that we must try and keep to the time limit. Diana.
I agree with the Honourable Gentleman, and as I said right at the beginning, I am not against assisted dying in any circumstances. If this bill passes, we will have the NHS as a fully funded 100% suicide service, but palliative care will only be funded at 30% at best. The former member for Dunfermline East, Gordon Brown, has said recently, we need to show we can do better at assisted living before deciding whether to legislate on ways to die. I represent very many vulnerable people in marginalised communities. I cannot vote for a bill where I have doubts about whether they will be protected. We can come back, we can have a commission, we can craft a better bill, but I will not be voting for this bill this morning.
Andrew Mitchell. Up to 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to make just three brief points. The first one, Mr. Speaker, is that I have completely changed my mind on this subject since I entered the House during the last century. And the reason for that is that I've sat in my advice surgery and I have had tears pouring down my face listening to constituents who have set out so clearly, speaking with such emotion about how their mother, brother, father or child has died in great pain and great indignity. And I strongly support this bill. I want to congratulate the Honourable Lady for the excellent way in which she has presented it. But I believe that we should give our constituents, our fellow citizens, this choice. I want this choice for my constituents. I want it for those whom I love. And indeed, I want it perhaps one day, Mr. Speaker, for myself. The current law forces people... I'm not giving away, I'm afraid. The current law forces people to plan their deaths in secret. Their bodies are found by their loved ones. They often die in the most horrific circumstances. They have no chance to say goodbye to their loved ones. It is devastating for their families. And the former Health Secretary commissioned the Office of National Statistics to try and find out how many people who committed suicide every year were dying people, and the figure was between 300 and 650. The second point I want to make is this. In our democracy, it is we, the Commons, who must make this decision. It is only we, elected by our constituents, who have the legitimacy to do this. It is not the DPP, it is not the CPS, it is not the police, doctors, or even unelected members of the House of Lords. It is this House of Commons that must make this decision. And let us be clear, Mr. Speaker, that we, all of us, on both sides of this debate, strongly support the increase in the quality and extent of palliative